Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us here. My name is Guzzardi. I'm state representative from the 39th district on the northwest side of Chicago. I'm so excited to be joined by a wonderful panel to discuss the issues facing the LGBTQ plus community during the coronavirus pandemic. So thank you all for being here. I'll introduce our panelists in just a minute. But first, I want to just give a few introductory remarks. A couple of quick thank yous to Emily Melby and Josette Galindo from my office for planning and preparing this event, getting everybody together. Thank you, of course, to our panelists and to all of you who are joining us tonight live, and to those of you who shared the word about this event. We really appreciate you helping us get this out there to the broader community. And I'll just start by saying that obviously we're living in very challenging, difficult times. The pandemic has been hard in so many ways for so many of us. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's been especially challenging for those people in those communities who were already facing hardships and structural inequities before this time, right? That, you know, people were all struggling financially and economically in this moment, but people who didn't have money saved up in the bank for an emergency are in much more dire straits. And I think similarly, the LGBTQ community, all of the sort of structural inequities that have been facing that community for so long have only been exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic. You know, people who face employment discrimination. Obviously, it's so hard for anyone to find a job in this economy when there's tens of millions of people unemployed, and people who are discriminated against at work face that in more dire ways. People who are unhoused or who are in unsafe housing situations are struggling to find somewhere new to live, struggling to leave a housing situation that they don't want to be in, or struggling to find a housing situation that's stable. And these are challenges that the LGBTQ community has faced disproportionately for a long time. And we're very fortunate in Chicago and in Illinois to have a number of amazing organizations and advocates and leaders who are fighting for the rights of the LGBTQ community and to secure resources to help people in crisis and to help LGBTQ folks get through this challenging moment and sort of every challenging moment that that comes down the road. So I'm so happy to be joined by so many leaders from that movement this evening, and look forward to a discussion about the amazing work that you all are doing and the services you're providing, and also about the challenges that the community is facing and how all of us can come together and help. So let me just, I'll briefly just sort of read through each of your names and titles, and then ask you each to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about the work that you do. But before we do that, to the folks who are watching live right now, we're going to put up some poll questions throughout the evening. We want you to be engaging and interacting with us as we go through this event. So we'll have a few questions up on the Facebook Live, poll questions that you can respond to. You don't need to type the answer into the chat. You should be able just to click the answer. If you have questions throughout the evening, you're certainly more than welcome to put those in the chat, and I think we'll reserve a little time toward the end to try to answer those. And anything that we don't get to here live, we'll be sure to follow up with you offline. So feel free to do that. But first, we're going to put up our first poll question, which asks if you identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, as trans, as non-binary or queer, or as none of the above, or an ally. So feel free to choose whatever responses fits you best from that list. And with that, I'm going to introduce very quickly our esteemed panel this evening. We have Tim Jackson from the AIDS Foundation, Stephanie Scora from the Brave Space Alliance, Mike Ziri from Equality Illinois, and Alderman Carlos Ramirez Rosa from the 35th Ward. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And let's just start with the order that I see you in on my little screen here. So we'll start with Tim. And I'm going to ask each of you the same question to open this up. Tell us a little bit about who you are in your work in your organization, and share with us one an exciting, positive development that you've seen in recent years for the community that you work with. Something, and there's so much hard and challenging and painful news right now. I want us to all start off on a nice positive note. So something great that you've seen happening, some progress that you've seen made. So I'll turn it over to you, Tim. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much, Representative Guzzardi, for allowing me to join in on tonight's conversation. Timothy Jackson, pronouns he, him, and his, Director of Government Relations for AIDS Foundation Chicago. Naturally, AFC for over 30 years has been providing care to people living with or vulnerable to HIV. And so I get the esteemed honor of doing a lot of the advocacy work on a statewide level for our clients, not just for AFC, but for people living with or vulnerable to HIV across the state. So one of the big things that I think about often when it comes to kind of some of the progress we've made the LGBTQ community is just happened a couple of months ago. The Supreme Court's decision basically that upheld that sexual orientation and gender identity are held up as in employment discrimination against those protected classes are against the law. And so that is a huge win. And so I look forward to seeing that go along the Fair Housing Act and on down the line in subsequent cases. So that's my.
That's great. Thank you so much. That's definitely an exciting development. And I know it's an issue we've been working on here in Illinois for a long time. So great to see the Supreme Court doing what's right there. Stephanie, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, Stephanie Scora, she, her, and hers. I am the Associate Executive Director for Brave Space Alliance. We are a Black-led, all-trans LGBTQ center serving the south and west sides of Chicago, and with a particular focus on Black and brown trans people. I think probably the most exciting development that we've seen for the communities that we work with is the recent policy win that we were a part of at Lurie Children's Hospital, where in collaboration with the Intersex Justice Project, which is a Black and brown intersex-led organization with roots right here in Chicago, we were able to pressure Lurie Children's Hospital into stopping medically unnecessary conversion therapy from being performed on intersex infants and children. We're really still trying to look to hold them accountable, but they've made a number of commitments to stop these surgeries or to stop a variety of these surgeries from happening. And we're looking forward to working with our community partners in other LGBTQ organizations in the city and across the state, and with our friends on the county board and city council and in the General Assembly to hopefully pass some legislation to make sure that, even though Lurie has made these commitments to stop doing these harmful forms of conversion therapy on intersex infants and youth right now, that they can't change their mind later, because hopefully it will be unlawful. And we're trying to make Illinois the first state in the country, and Chicago and Cook County, some of the first states and counties or cities and counties in the country to formally recognize the human rights and bodily autonomy of intersex folks.
That's fantastic. Yeah, amazing work on that campaign, and really appreciate your guys' leadership on that fight. And congratulations on the big victories there.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll kick it over to Mike. Go for it.
Hey, Representative, thanks so much for having me tonight, and to these esteemed panelists to be here with you tonight as well. Mike Ziri, he, him, his, Director of Public Policy at Equality Illinois, the state's LGBTQ civil rights organization. And what I have been, inspired by, over the last several years, normally I would travel all over the state right now, throughout the summer, going to all corners of the state, meeting with community organizations. And one thing, I've just been so inspired over the past few years by the advocacy by communities across the state. We're seeing organizations from Chicago to Carbondale deepen their power, leverage their leadership. And just an example of that, in terms of civic engagement in 2016, we saw 2,000 LGBTQ Illinoisans take a civic action with Equality Illinois, which could be something like emailing a legislator, attending a town hall. In 2019, we saw 10,000 LGBTQ people take a civic action, and over half of those are outside of Cook County. So I'm just really inspired by the deepening of the power, the leveraging of leadership that we're seeing across the state over the last few years by the LGBTQ community, which then further reminds, Representative, your colleagues that LGBTQ people are everywhere in Illinois. But thank you so much for having me tonight, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, that not only are LGBTQ people everywhere in the state, but that they are engaging civically and active and prepared to participate in the process and prepared to hold accountable those who try to deny their rights. So I think that's, you guys, Equality Illinois has been such an incredible leader in that civic mobilization and activation. So huge kudos to you all. And Alderman, why don't you round us out? Let us know something you're excited about.
Thank you so much, Representative Guzzardi, Will, for having me on this panel. I will say one of the things that has really inspired me in the last several months has seen tens of thousands of people take to the streets to say Black Lives Matter and to say Black trans lives matter. To see people come out, particularly in the city of Chicago, and demand a civilian police accountability council, to demand community control of the police and democratic control over those systems that are supposed to keep us safe, but so often have become tools of oppression and violence against Black people, trans people, queer people, marginalized people from all different backgrounds. So that has been so inspiring. I was at a march in Boys Town just some weeks ago where thousands of people came out and said CPAC now, thousands of people came out and say Black trans lives matter. And it has just really been inspiring to see so many people in movement in opposition to so many of the oppressive systems that have marginalized and silenced people for so long.
Yeah, it's been really powerful, and I think we'll talk more about the sort of intersectionality of this movement with the other movements for justice that are happening a little bit later in our discussion. But yeah, I think the growing awareness of police violence against trans people, especially trans people of color, has been really an important part of this discussion around policing that we're having now as a city and as a country. So I want to ask each of you a specific set of questions about your respective areas of expertise. But first, I want to kick another poll question over to the audience. This one is going to be an open-ended question. And we want to ask you the same question that we just asked our panelists. So can you share with us the most exciting positive development that you've seen or you felt you've gotten excited about in recent years for the LGBTQ community? So take a second, feel free to fill that in, a couple of words or a couple of pages, whatever you want to say. And while you do that, we're going to ask the first question to Mike. Mike, let's take a second and talk about the sort of truncated legislative session that we just had this year. So typically the Illinois General Assembly meets from January to May. And obviously things were interrupted this spring. The session was adjourned in March, and we didn't reconvene until the very end of May for just a few days, and passed a small handful of pieces of legislation before adjourning for the spring session. So Mike, maybe you can start by talking about anything that we did pass this year that you think will affect the LGBTQ community. And then also let's talk a little bit about Equality Illinois' agenda moving into the next legislative session in the spring of 2021, on how COVID-19 is going to affect that agenda, and how you see that agenda being shaped given all the forces at play right now.
Sure, and that's a lot of questions. So
a lot of questions, I know.
I'll do my best to remember them all. But yeah, you're right. It was a very abbreviated session. I think it was 5 days at the end of May, and it was great to see all of the House in the Springfield Convention Center, which I used to be on the board of. So I hope you enjoyed it. But yeah, there weren't a ton of bills that passed, but there were some pretty significant ones. And I just want to really pull out two. One, a piece of the budget that is really significant, and that Illinois is now the first state to ensure that Medicaid will cover undocumented seniors. So really applaud the work of yourself, your colleagues, Representative Ramirez especially, and the advocates who fought for that, to include that in the budget, and for not falling for the calls of some of your colleagues for austerity, which austerity in a time of crisis is not good policy. But the other big bill that I think is really important that affects LGBTQ people and all Illinoisans is the election bill that you all passed and that the governor signed which enhances vote by mail in Illinois, which is really critical now. It also allows for ballot drop off locations, so that are not mailboxes, which, boy, that's really important these days. When you think of what the Trump administration is doing with the Postal Service. I also really love a piece of that bill that allows 16-year-olds to be election judges. So it allows young people to more deeply engage in the electoral process. So really excited by that law. Good bill. Hope it gets extended beyond 2020. But I think that leads into also a big point, a big focus of our work, which is the election, the upcoming election. And there's a lot of focus, rightfully so, on the national level. But I think there's also a lot of reasons why the election in Illinois is important to LGBTQ Illinoisans. One, it's an opportunity to shore up our pro-equality majorities. And when I say that, I always use the example of last year, with your support, your co-sponsorship, your vote, we passed the inclusive curriculum law to include LGBTQ contributions in history in public schools. That bill passed with 60 votes, which is the bare minimum that you need to pass a bill in the Illinois House. And we have the opportunity this election across the state to add more pro-equality, voices to the legislature to shore up those majorities. Also, there are, from what I can tell, the most ever LGBTQ people running for the legislature this year. Back in the primary, there were 14 candidates for the state house. There are now 11 candidates who are LGBTQ for the state house, so including the 4 incumbents. But there are multiple candidates across the state for local offices. So really inspiring to see LGBTQ people stepping up, running for office across the state and for the state house. And 2 other really important reasons why this election matters to LGBTQ people: redistricting. He or she or they who can draw the map can control the destiny of the legislature for the next decade. And we've seen in states like Wisconsin where right-wing reactionary forces have taken control of the legislature, redrawn the map, and entrenched anti-equality forces, anti-women forces. We need to make sure that doesn't happen in Illinois. So that's why this election is important. And the 4th reason, the fair tax, the fair tax, the fair tax, the fair tax. A matter of fairness, of equity. We know data shows that LGBTQ people disproportionately utilize and access public services like housing assistance, like unemployment insurance, like supplemental nutrition assistance programs, and Medicaid. So it's incumbent on all of us then to make sure that those services are shored up, and the fair tax will help that. LGBTQ Illinoisans, working minimum wage should not have to pay the same tax rate as Chicago billionaires. So we support the fair tax, and we are encouraging everyone, LGBTQ and non-LGBTQ, to support the fair tax as well in November or October or whenever you get your vote by mail ballot. But that was a long answer to the session and some of our priorities this year. Going into the next session, we're looking at legislation that we've been working on around comprehensive mandated sex ed in Illinois. We're working on legislation around birth certificates to get rid of the requirement that you have to have a doctor's note to correct the gender marker on your birth certificate. But there's also some great coalition work being done. We need in Illinois to pass a paid sick days bill, which we tried, either the coalition tried to pass this year, but it just didn't happen this year. But a paid sick days bill that covers chosen families, which is so important to LGBTQ people. A paid, family and medical leave bill, which also covers chosen families. And we're big proponents of the Gun Violence Prevention Coalition's bill to block illegal gun ownership, because we know about the violence in the lives of trans folks, particularly with gun violence. So we look forward to passing some of our own initiatives, but also engaging in some of that coalition work to uplift those other big initiatives that will make Illinois an even better and more affirming state? That was a really long answer for you.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. And I asked you a million questions, but also lots of really good stuff there. I mean, the stuff on the elections, I think, is so critically important. Yeah, excited about the agenda work next year, particularly around the sick days and family leave. I think it's high time, and we have the majorities, and we have a governor who's eager to support it, and we got to get it done. I'm going to pose the next couple of questions to Timothy. So a couple of questions for you. One is, how has the coronavirus pandemic sort of affected the way that AIDS Foundation and your partners interact with the communities that you serve? And then also, we've worked together and we've worked in coalition together around the affordability of healthcare in general and the affordability of prescription drugs in particular. So what are some of the healthcare access challenges that face the LGBTQ community generally, and how have you seen the coronavirus pandemic exacerbating some of those challenges?
Sure, thank you so much. As I mentioned earlier, AFC, AIDS Foundation Chicago, provides care to people living with or vulnerable to HIV through housing, prevention, capacity building, and a lot through statewide advocacy. Naturally, of course, COVID-19 came on the scene. We had to change up our game. Of course, like many other organizations, did a lot of working from home. But of course, we know that just because a global pandemic hits, that does not mean that the people that we serve no longer need our help. It actually kind of raises the stakes. So I believe in life, there are no coincidences, and that things happen for a reason. In February of this year, we worked with the Center Hall set to open the Hiv Resource Hub, a facility that helps with emergency financial assistance, rent, utility payments for not only people living with HIV, but who are also HIV negative and taking PrEP all across Chicagoland. And so that links people to medications, case management, medical care, food, mental health, substance use treatment, and even more. And so, of course, when COVID came, beginning in April, we added an additional layer for COVID, for those that are affected by COVID, in the form of, again, rental payments, mortgage payments, internet payments, cell phones, emergency food assistance, some of these bare, basic, essential needs that our clients and our communities need and deserve. And so that's how we really try to maintain our connections with the communities that we serve. You mentioned kind of AFC's work with you on prescription drugs. And absolutely, we know that prescription drugs only work if they're affordable and accessible. And of course, prescription drug access to either antiretroviral therapy for people living with HIV and pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP, a pill that's taken once a day for people vulnerable to HIV is paramount, but it doesn't just stop there. You need access to healthcare and addressing other important social determinants of health, like housing instability, food insecurity, like I was just mentioning. We know this greatly impacts the LGBTQ community and other marginalized groups. We understand and know that discrimination and stigma often puts LGBTQ community at heightened risk for a number of health issues, from depression, addiction, cancer, HIV, and other chronic conditions. And then also we've seen the Trump administration issue guidance that would roll back protections of Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, which prohibits sex discrimination in healthcare and also prohibits discrimination against transgender people. Thankfully, this week, a federal judge issued a temporary injunction that would halt the implementation of these changes to Section 1557. And so when you're looking about that in that broader scope, those are some of the challenges and hurdles that the LGBTQ community faces. And so when you look at that and you look COVID directly in the face, what the pandemic has really revealed is these populations that have been historically marginalized, the LGBTQ community, as well as Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, are more vulnerable to COVID. What COVID has highlighted are the inequalities and health inequities among these communities that have existed way before we do anything about COVID-19. And unfortunately, the pandemic has only exacerbated these challenges for these communities. And it's up to us really to do the work, to identify these challenges head on, and then amplify the voice of the people most impacted by them, and then work to resolve them through advocacy, through direct action, and through community engagement and education.
You guys are doing phenomenal work on all those fronts. Yeah, on the advocacy side, it's always been, it's been great working with you all down in Springfield on these issues, and you've been provided such a clear sort of voice and moral vision on these issues. So I deeply appreciate the work that AFC is doing. Before I ask a couple of questions to Stephanie, let's put another poll question up there. So I think the way it's set up is that you're able to choose up to 2 of these options, and it may be true that all of these are true for you, so just maybe choose the 2 most relevant or something. But just to get a sense of how coronavirus has affected those of you who are watching. So has it affected your employment, your hours on the job, your access to healthcare, your participation in community activities, your social, emotional well-being? Choose any of those that apply, and if there's not enough buttons for you to choose, you can feel free to add some more commentary in the comment section. As folks answer that question, let me kick it over to Stephanie for a minute. So your organization, Brave Space Alliance, focuses on providing resources for trans people and services for trans people, specifically trans people of color. So maybe start by framing the conversation with a little history. How have trans people of color been left out of the LGBTQ conversation in the past, and how does your organization sort of work to change that? And then how have you seen, the same sort of question I've asked everybody else, how have you seen this pandemic affect the population you serve, and how is Brave Space Alliance sort of stepping in to fill the void for some of those?
Yeah, I think the first question for me is particularly interesting because it's not just that Black and brown trans people have been left out of the conversations of LGBTQ history, but it's that Black and brown trans people have been explicitly forced out of the conversation. And from day one, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson started what we consider the contemporary LGBTQ rights movement. And then by the next year, there were white cisgender gay men trying to force them to the sidelines so that the movement could be co-opted. It was very recently after Stonewall, or very soon after Stonewall, that Sylvia Rivera had to fight to get up on a stage at a pride parade and to deliver her famous "Y'all Better Quiet Down" speech, which if folks in the audience haven't listened to the speech, you should Google Sylvia Rivera, "Y'all Better Quiet Down" and take a listen. It's less than 5 minutes, and it is one of the best pieces of public speaking of queer history, and really just it's a fantastic watch. And I think there's been a lot of different reasons why Black and brown trans people, and trans people overall, but specifically Black and brown trans people, have been forced out of the movement. And a large part of that is because there's been this really insidious combination of structural white supremacy and structural transphobia within the mainstream LGBTQ rights movement. Ever since, as I said, ever since the movement began, white folks, cisgender folks, wealthy folks who hold these marginalized identities have sought to use the movement to help them assimilate into heterosexual cisgender culture, and to really advance this narrative that we're just like you. We just want to be like the straight people. We just want to be like the cisgender people. We want to have our 2.5 kids, 1.5 pets, a house and a white picket fence in the suburbs, and go about our merry lives. And in fact, that is not necessarily the case for all of us. And the fact that trans people are so wonderfully diverse, not just in race, obviously, but in terms of our gender, posed a threat to those arguments and those points of respectability that a lot of folks in the mainstream LGBTQ movement were advancing for many, many years. And for a shamefully long time, trans people were considered really the ugly stepchild of the movement, when in fact we were the originators, the matriarchs of that movement. And the same is so even more so for Black and brown trans folks. And the thing that's really beautiful about the current moment is that for the last, I would say 10, 15 years, Black and brown trans folks have rather collectively stood up and said, we're not taking this anymore. We are no longer going to be forced into the shadows of this movement that we created. We are no longer going to have our voices silenced. We're no longer going to sit on the sidelines while our sisters are murdered in the streets. We're going to stand up, we're going to fight back, and we're going to take the power away from these mainstream LGBTQ organizations. You know, when Sylvia Rivera died, a lot of folks don't know this, but she stated in an interview on her deathbed that her goal in life at the moment was to destroy the Human Rights Campaign because of what they had done to trans people. And I think that anger from Sylvia was really carried forward after her death by the dozens and dozens of powerful Black and brown trans women across the nation who took the lead that she and Marcia had provided and really ran with it. And what we're seeing right now is in the aftermath is organizations like Brave Space Alliance. We were founded by a Black trans woman who had really had enough of Black and brown trans people in Chicago being used as more or less an afterthought in the agendas of many LGBTQ organizations in the city. You know, Black and brown trans folks were more than welcome at programs when there was research to be done, or HIV tests to be conducted, or diversity that was needed at a panel or at a speaking event. But were the concerns of the community ever really put at the forefront? No, they were not. And so Brave Space Alliance came to be, and we're really, you know, when we say we're Black-led and all trans, we live those values. Brave Space Alliance is an organization founded in the revolutionary tradition of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. We are a Black liberation organization. We are a trans liberation organization. We are for us, by us. Everything we do is with the interests of Black and brown trans people at the forefront. And I think that really segues into your next question, Will, was what have we been doing during coronavirus? How has coronavirus impacted the community? And, you know, coronavirus has provided a fascinating moment for not just Brave Space Alliance, but for Black and brown trans folks across the city and across the country. We've already surpassed this year the number of trans women murdered publicly that we had all 2019. And it's only August. We've still got 4 of the deadliest months left in the year. We haven't even hit Trans Day of Remembrance yet. And our totals in 2020 have already surpassed that of 2019. And when I talk about these statistics, I always find it's important to remind people that just because more trans women are being murdered publicly does not mean that trans women were not being murdered at this rate before. It's that we simply did not know about it, because the epidemic of misgendering and dead naming trans women after our deaths is still very much a factor in the community's ability to claim our dead and recognize those that we've lost as members of our families and of our communities. And that's still happening today. You know, many of the trans women that were murdered had to be reclaimed after their deaths by their community. And this is, you know, it's just another part of that toxic system of structural white supremacy and structural transphobia combining to not only make trans women, Black and brown trans women in particular, invisible during their lives, but completely disappeared after their deaths, unless the community has the knowledge of that individual to articulate their truth and reclaim their narrative. And during COVID-19, you know, I'm sure everybody on this panel, and I'm sure many people in the audience, are familiar with the public health struggles that Black and brown trans people encounter. You know, HIV rates in Black trans communities have been stagnant for decades, especially in Chicago. HIV rates in Latinx trans communities have actually been on the rise slowly. And when we have a respiratory pandemic assaulting our city and particularly impacting those with compromised immune systems, it's been all hands on deck for Brave Space. And we responded really immediately. I think we shut down our office before the city shut down. And we immediately put into place two emergency programs to help our community ride the wave of COVID-19, however long that wave is going to turn out to be. And And the first was the Trans Relief Fund, which provided micro grants to Black and brown trans people in Chicago. We launched that in mid-March and got $80,000 worth of requests in the first 24 hours of the Trans Relief Fund. We're actually shutting it down officially this month because we've continued to get requests that we aren't able to keep up with. But we're very proud to be able to say we redistributed $120,000 to Black and brown trans people across our city to help them get food on their table, to help them pay their rent, pay their bills, keep their lights on, keep their cell phone in working condition, and to help them maintain their connection, not just to the city and to their own lives, but to their community. And connection to community has been another really, really important factor of this pandemic, because all of the prevailing research shows that trans people of every race depend on our community for survival. Trans people who experience growth in our identities or exploration or change in our identities in isolation face negative public health outcomes and mental and physical safety outcomes at several degrees worse than those who are able to go through those changes with a community. And so the loss of being able to congregate in person has been a significant blow to the folks that we serve, not only because it's making people ask themselves the question, well, do I risk my life to see the people that I love, or do I give up the community that tethers me to my existence? And the other aspect is food insecurity. Food insecurity is already a huge problem in our city, especially on the south and the west sides. So many people live in food deserts. So many neighborhoods are being gentrified so that the residents, the longtime residents, aren't able to afford food steps from their door any longer. You can find people across our city who have been pushed out of the resources in their very own neighborhoods because of wealthy developers, because of white gentrifiers, because of a number of factors, including irresponsible use of TIF money by our city and by the current mayor and the previous mayor, and handouts like the billion given to Lincoln Yards when our communities and our schools are in disrepair and have been disinvested in. And so what Brave Space Alliance did was we stepped up and we created the Brave Space Alliance Crisis Pantry, which provides delivery bags of food and essential supplies and PPE directly to the door of people in need in the city of Chicago. And in the first 2 months of the pandemic, before the George Floyd rebellions began, we delivered food and supplies to over 3,000 unique people, not just on the south and west side, but across our whole city, because we knew that this wasn't a time to limit our services. And as a Black and trans liberation organization, when the George Floyd rebellions began in Chicago, we knew our place was on the front line. And so we expanded our crisis pantry to serve those putting their bodies on the line for political action, and to service those who are doing the essential work of jail support for those unjustly arrested and detained by the Chicago Police Department. And since then, the pantry has really just exploded. We've been able to broaden our services to a degree that we never thought possible. And in the time since the rebellions began to the end of this week, we've served an additional 40,000 people at minimum across the city of Chicago. We now have satellite locations in Little Village, Garfield Park, and Albany Park, where we have distribution locations that Black and brown families, and especially LGBTQ folks, can come and get bags of groceries every week, can come keep putting food on their tables, can come get supplies for their babies, can come get masks and gloves, or even things like toilet paper and condoms and other essentials that you might not be able to find at your average food bank. And we've done this all, really importantly, independently. We're running one of the only independent food pantries in the city of Chicago and the only LGBTQ focused pantry in the Midwest. And we're actually, with our partner organizations, we're liberating some of these organizations, like our partner Project Vita in Little Village, from the restrictions of Ryan White funding, which limit their services to people only living with or at risk for HIV, so that they can expand their services in their pantry with our support and our supplies to everybody in need in their community. And thanks to the generous contributions of our community and several of our funders, we've been able to make the Brave Space Crisis Pantry a permanent part of our program going forward. So we're going to be keeping these satellite pantries open through the pandemic and afterwards. And we're going to keep expanding our food redistribution network and our supply redistribution network so that we can serve every single LGBTQ person in the city of Chicago who is in need of food or supplies any time of the year, any day of the week, pandemic or no pandemic. We're not going to let our community struggle. And we've been picking up the slack for some of the larger organizations in this city who haven't been able to mobilize and do mutual aid on the scale that we're prepared to. I mean, we're a staff of community organizers. We hire people specifically with the politics and the experience that we know we need as an all trans organization, as a Black-led organization, to pivot and go political as soon as we need to, because our very existence is political. The existence and the well-being of our community is political, and the mutual aid that we engage in to serve our communities is how we're going to keep ourselves alive. And we're really, really proud of the response that we've been able to have to the pandemic and the amount of people that we've been able to serve.
Yeah, it's amazing work that you guys are doing, and there's a lot in that answer that you just gave to unpack. I mean, I think I appreciate the sort of pushback on the framing that I gave in my question to you. I think you're right to make it, to sort of put that verb in active voice about the exclusion, that it was a pushing out rather than a leaving out. I think that's a really important distinction to draw on. It also reminds me, and this will be a segue to my questions for the alderman, but it reminds me of like the very first bill I ever presented on the floor of the Illinois House when I was first elected in 2015 was guaranteeing that transgender people can put in their wills and disposition documents how they want to be presented at their funeral. And just, you told that story and you underscored that point about the many acts of violence against trans people that have been erased after their deaths, right? And yeah, I think it's the fact that we're seeing the number of these public and reported incidents go up is in large part a feature of, as you said, increased visibility, right? That the community is coming out of the shadows in a different way, and which is a wonderful thing in so many ways, and also, casting a harsh light on the realities of the violence in the community space for so long. So yeah, and thank you for all the incredible work that you guys are doing all over the city. It's totally phenomenal, and you're role models to all of us. But so on that legislative subject, let me kick it over to the alderman. So Alderman Rosa, tell us a little bit about some of the legislative victories that you've been a part of in your, I guess now probably 5 years in city council, and ordinances that you're working on coming up to expand LGBTQ rights. And then maybe you can tell us sort of how you assess the city's performance so far during the pandemic in terms of continuing to provide the needed services to LGBTQ people during these challenging times.
So when I took office in 2015, for the first time in the history of the Chicago City Council, we had 5 openly gay or lesbian members of the Chicago City Council, which meant that we met the threshold to form a caucus of the Chicago City Council. So we formed the LGBT caucus of the Chicago City Council, a first for a city in the Midwest. Now, I will point out that I was a little bit peeved by the fact that we were calling ourselves the LGBT caucus, when in fact we were 1 lesbian and 4 gay men. But I will say that it was part of our aspiration to be representative of all the members of our family as to why we included the B and the T in the name of our caucus. Now, if you remember some years ago in the South, there was a wave of legislation to criminalize trans people using the bathroom that they felt most comfortable using as part of their gender expression. And Mayor Rahm Emanuel called this out. And it was in fact our then Commissioner of Human Relations, Mona Noriega, who said, hey, Mayor Emanuel, you're calling this out in the South and saying this is so horrific and horrible that the South is criminalizing trans people using the bathroom, but that's actually the policy on our books right here in the city of Chicago right now. It said that you had to use the bathroom that matched with the sex that was listed on your ID, and that if you use the bathroom that did not match the sex listed on your ID, you could be criminalized, you could be arrested, you could be thrown out of a business. And so the LGBT caucus got to work, and we worked to pass the Trans Bathroom Access Ordinance to ensure that anyone could use the bathroom of their choice where they felt most comfortable. And I'm very proud of the work that the LGBT caucus did, working with our colleagues in the Chicago City Council to move this forward. And so in effect, today in the city of Chicago, we ensure that people, regardless of their gender expression, can go and use the bathroom that they feel safest and most comfortable using, which can really be an issue of life or death for many trans people when they are presented with a situation where they are being asked to go into a bathroom that does not match their gender expression. That could be something that can cause a lot of anxiety, that can cause a lot of fear, and that can oftentimes lead to violence and hate crimes perpetrated against them. So that's a significant piece of legislation that we passed during my first term. As the LGBT caucus, we continue to be committed to moving forward legislation that addresses the issues that are impacting our LGBT community. But I think it's also extremely important that we understand that so many of the issues that we talk about, whether that be housing, whether that be living wages, workers' rights, also disproportionately impact some of the members of our LGBTQ family that are most marginalized, our trans Black sisters and brothers, our queer siblings, our non-binary siblings. And so it's been extremely important for me in this work to really highlight the ways in which housing is a human right, in which people have rights to workers' rights, in which people have a right to living wages, and to really understand that workers' rights are LGBTQ rights, that housing as a human right means that LGBTQ people have housing as a human right, and really understanding that intersectionality of those issues when we're advocating and fighting for those changes in the halls of our city.
Well, that's a great segue into the topic I want to spend a little time talking about, but also how many LGBT members are there in City Council now? We elected a couple more in 2019, didn't we?
Yeah, so Maria Haddon was elected in the 49th ward. She is a lesbian woman. We continue to have Tom Tunney, who represents Lakeview and Boys Town. We have James Kappelman, who represents Uptown. We have Raymond Lopez, who represents portions of the South Side. We have myself, who represents portions of the Northwest Side. And then most recently, my work wife, Rosana Rodriguez, who represents the 33rd Ward, she came out as queer, which I have to say I'm very proud of myself. Sometimes people say, Carlos, you can't keep a secret. But I will say that, yes, I can keep a secret. You know, Rosana, you know, shared that in confidence with me sometime before she came out to the general public. So if I can do my math correctly, we are now at 6 members of the Chicago City Council that identify as gay, lesbian, or queer. And, you know, to be very honest, I think as queer folks, we've always known this, there's probably a few more in there, but, you know, everyone at their own time and at their own pace.
Right. So let me just, each of us has sort of talked a bit about this question of intersectionality, and I want to pose it to the group, and we can just sort of ping pong this around a little bit. So I'll start with Stephanie. So we're obviously, as you mentioned, we're in this moment of this rebellion, this uprising against police violence. We're in this moment of this global pandemic, which is exacerbating the crises that our communities have been facing for so long. So maybe you guys can all sort of talk about like both directions of the two-way street here. So like how does the LGBTQ movement join these other movements for social justice, and how do those movements for social justice sort of create space for LGBTQ activism and leadership?
Yeah, you know, I think the answer is actually super easy, and that's that every movement needs to follow the lead of Black trans people. And that's, you know, it's a very effective 2 birds, 1 stone there, because, you know, queer and trans people have always been on the forefront of every movement for justice. You know, we have recognized in our community for a long time that the liberation of the most marginalized among us will liberate us all. At least those of us who have been politically active have realized this. There have been some who are a little bit more stubborn, but those who have known for a long time. And that means in our spaces, Black trans people, Black intersex people, you know, Black lesbians, Black gay men, Black folks in general in our community who have been on the forefront of most of these movements. And we can point to a Black or brown, queer or trans person at the front of almost every single major justice movement in the history of this country. And, you know, it's so easy to follow the leadership of the most marginalized, because truly, as Brave Space Alliance is really fond of saying, our communities know all the solutions to the problems that we face. We have a solution for HIV in Black and brown trans communities. We have a solution for employment discrimination, for housing discrimination, for food deserts, for most of the things that impact our day to day. The issue is that we're very rarely given the mic. We're even more rarely given enough resources to make these solutions a reality in our community. And I think, folks who occupy positions of privilege in LGBTQ communities really need to take a step back, evaluate what they've been doing, and hand the mic, hand some of those resources over to Black and brown trans people, especially Black and brown trans women who have been advocating for these solutions in Chicago and around the country for a very long time. And the same goes for cisgender heterosexual folks who have been at the forefront of other movements for justice. I guarantee if they look behind them, there is a gaggle of queer and trans folks just racing to get that mic and to get to the forefront of that movement. And I do realize that a lot of movement organizing is deferential to elders and is deferential to folks who have been in the scene for a long time. But I think this in particular is a moment where we have to listen to young people. We have to listen to multiply marginalized people. We have to listen to people who really have their finger on not just the pulse of the issue at hand, but their own pulse, because they are experiencing all of the issues at hand. And we have to be really careful not to fall victim to a simple identity politics analysis. I'm sitting here and I'm saying, we got to listen to Black trans people, we got to listen to Black gay people, but we also have to listen to what those folks are telling us, because not every single marginalized person, not every single multiply marginalized person is going to be a champion for justice in the way that their community needs. And we need to listen not only to the individuals, but to the communities at hand, the relevant communities that are saying, this is a person who has all of our interests at heart and is not just for themselves. This person is for all of us. This person will work for justice. And we need to follow the leaders chosen by the community and the communities as a whole themselves, to make sure that we're truly advancing justice and not the political agenda of an individual, or not the political agenda of a person who may be tokenized for the wealthy and powerful. We've got a number of issues at play in our state. I think Carlos brought up one in his intro, which was CPAC. We really need to make sure that something about police accountability is done in this city. Something has needed to be done for a very long time. And, Black trans people have been fighting that issue from a number of different angles. I think it's one of the things Brave Space Alliance likes to call attention to as well, is that until January of last year, when Brave Space Alliance pressured the Chicago Police Department to investigate and solve the murder of a Black trans woman in our city, it had been 20 years since CPD had solved the murder of a trans woman in Chicago. 20 years, 1999 to 2019, since a murder of a trans woman had been solved in our city. And
that's astonishing.
It is, and it's heinous. And if you look at CPD's case solving rate, it might not be that surprising, but 20 years is a long time. And one of the things that community control of the police means is not just police abolition, but it means that on that road to abolition, we have to recognize that acknowledging that violence exists is the first part of acknowledging that the victims and survivors of that violence matter. When we say Black Lives Matter, when we say Black trans lives matter, we're not just saying stand up against injustice that's committed against Black people and trans people and Black trans people. We're saying acknowledge that this injustice exists, acknowledge that these people are more vulnerable to harm, and acknowledge that there is a multifaceted solution, which ends in the abolition of police, which ends in the abolition of prisons, which ends in the dismantling of a carceral justice system and white supremacist, transphobic, capitalist ways of governing. But also along that path includes acknowledging that our communities have experienced tremendous harm and have been repeatedly victimized and have been repeatedly tokenized and have been left out to dry by many people who have called themselves either representatives or champions for the cause. And the real only way to solve those issues and to give the community reparations for the historic harm that has been committed against us is to give us control, is to not just give us a seat at the table, but allow us to build the table and choose where to put it, and to choose who is with us when we choose to congregate at it. And that's really, that's the core of what intersectional justice is all about. Is it must be for the most marginalized and by the most marginalized and on the terms of the most marginalized. And that's really how we're going to get to the liberation that we all need.
That's very powerful stuff. And I think, right, I appreciate the sort of darkness of the frame and the clarity of it. Does other folks want to jump in on the question of intersectionality, the moment in policing, the moment in public health, and how it intersects with the work that you guys are doing?
Absolutely, I'll jump in. Something that Representative Guzzardi that we've been looking at ASC is the concept of course, racism is a public health issue. We cannot get to zero. We cannot take care of the people that we take care of, people living with or vulnerable to HIV, if we are not really looking at the systemic problems, the history of racism, white supremacy that have been so pervasive so long, that has basically marginalized groups of people here in Chicago and around the country. And so what does that look like? Does that look like just handling health as it is, as a very single term, specific term? Or what does that look like in terms of racial justice or housing insecurity, food insecurity, touching on so many different issues that is so much more than the physical word health. But it's really very much more complex than that. I think Stephanie hit on a point just a moment ago that is so it's simple to me. It's that we talk about Black Lives Matter, but do Black trans lives matter? And we can't get to Black Lives Matter until we acknowledge that too. We all know that in the LGBTQ community, it has a history of discrimination amongst other parts of the family. And so we have to be very honest and open and transparent about that history, address them head on, and that we understand that those intersecting communities matter, and we have to uplift them and amplify their voices and their experiences.
And I agree with everything that's been said so far. I do want to, we in Springfield, and this, Representative, I think, it's important to support and show up, for the broad progressive community. That means supporting labor rights and our partners in labor, UFCW, SEIU, et cetera. The immigrant and refugee rights organizations, and criminal justice issues. And what we, 4 years ago, when we started, active listening campaign with our stakeholders, we heard from our stakeholders across the state that, Equality Illinois had some deficits in terms of representation. Particularly, we heard this from women. We heard this from trans and gender nonconforming folks. We heard this from communities of color, and we heard this from people outside of Cook County. And so, since then, I think we've taken some steps and done some intentional, incredible work, making sure our boards are inclusive. So we're elevating leadership so that now our boards are more a majority women, almost half communities of color represented. We've built a community advisory group. So, from across the state, which we are accepting applications for right now, if folks want to apply to be considered for our community advisory group, but a community advisory group to help inform our policy work. to share information about what's happening in local communities across the state. And I think it's had tremendous impact. You know, that work has led us to support policies like the cannabis legalization bill last year through a racial equity lens. You know, we supported major initiatives like the RISE Act, you know, to tear down a barrier for undocumented students to be able to even apply for financial aid in Illinois. And, you know, we know there's more work to do, and, you know, recent events have inspired us. We've, you know, been articulating our values around reimagining public safety, but as an organization that listens and wants to hear from our stakeholders, we're actively listening. And we actually have a statewide survey right now on which almost has nearly, I think, 1,000 responses already of our stakeholders from across the state about what they want to see around public safety and policing. And if anybody wants to fill that out, it's on our Facebook page. And really trying to, you know, hear from all of our stakeholders around the state. But I think, you know, Stephanie and Timothy are 100% right. And I always remember a line from our friend William McNary at Citizen Action, and it's that we all do better when we all do better. And just important to ensure that you know, we show up for everyone in the community.
Thank you for that, Mike. Alderman, I think I'm going to kick the last question, actually. I'm going to start you with the last question, just in the interest of time. I know we're at the hour right now, and I want to leave time here in these last few minutes for this final section, which I think is very important. So we're going to put a poll question up for our viewers to ask, what kinds of resources do you and the people you know need the most right now? And Alderman, I'm going to start this final round of questions with you to answer the flip side of that question. So what kind of resources are you offering through your office, the rest of you guys through your various organizations, for LGBTQ folks and others getting through these difficult times? What legal resources should folks know about? What community resources should folks know about? Yeah, how can folks tap into the resources that you guys offer? So I'll start with you, and then we'll do a little roundtable and wrap it up.
Well, you know, the 35th Ward spans portions of 5 Northwest Side neighborhoods: Hermosa, Logan Square, Avondale, Irving Park, and Albany Park. We are home to people from all across the globe, and we have seen a tremendous need with rental assistance, with food assistance. We're so proud to be able to partner with food pantries in every single one of the neighborhoods that serve the 35th Ward. We've also been able to partner with a number of organizations that have been able to offer cash assistance, particularly to undocumented immigrant families in this moment who do not qualify for unemployment insurance despite having worked and paid into the system, who do not qualify for cash assistance despite contributing collectively nearly $18 billion+ per year in federal taxes. And so it's really devastating and tragic and frightening to see so many families, even if they are U.S. citizens, forgotten and left behind in this pandemic. The community has really been stepping up, and we've been able to set up and help assist in setting up mutual aid networks throughout the neighborhoods that we serve. But that community solidarity pales in comparison to the assistance that the federal government or that even our state government would be able to provide. We have seen the federal government just throw gobs of money at the financial sector, at very rich and connected individuals, while leaving our working families behind. So if you need assistance, we're happy to connect you as a 35th Ward office with the mutual aid networks and with the organizations, the food pantries, the nonprofits that offer cash assistance in our area. But at the same time, we as a city, we as working people need to come together and demand that our government step up and provide us the things that we need in this moment to survive this pandemic. We've earned it, we deserve it. We all need to have the cash assistance, the housing assistance that is really gonna allow us to survive this pandemic and come out stronger than before.
Thank you, Carl, that's exactly right. Stephanie, maybe you can tell us a bit about the pantries that you mentioned, how folks can find and access those resources or other resources.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you can go to our social media, Brave Space Alliance on Facebook and on Instagram. We post daily updates about our food pantry locations there. As soon as we finalize our agreements and really formalize these relationships with our partner organizations in Little Village and in Garfield Park and Albany Park, Albany Park, we've been really, really lucky to work with the 33rd Ward Working Families Office and Alderwoman Rosana Rodriguez. And hopefully we'll get to work a little bit with Carlos too, because he serves that neighborhood as well. And, you know, we've just been really moving a lot of supplies, a lot of food, a lot of essentials for the community. So if you show up to one of our locations that you can find on our social media, if you are a Black or brown person, we will be able to help you. And I think, you know, another thing that folks have touched on is, you know, folks are struggling economically. And no small part of that is due to the fact that our economy and our jobs have been disrupted monumentally by this pandemic. And I would really love to see probably the most transformative action that we could take in the state of Illinois to secure employment rights, not just for everyone, but in particular for Black and brown trans people, is to finally take on head on the at-will employment nature of jobs in the state of Illinois. I know that it's illegal in Illinois to fire somebody for being queer or trans, but when you can fire somebody for any reason, it's not that hard to find another reason. And so, you know, I would really love to see something done to make sure that when a Black or brown trans woman works her ass off, you know, tries really hard every day, finally overcomes immense discrimination to be able to get a job and maybe be her true self in the workplace, that she can't lose that stability and the hope of income, healthcare, and a career simply because one of her supervisors doesn't like that she's trans or doesn't like that she's bringing her full self to the workplace and finds some other reason to point to her performance to fire her. So I would love to see Illinois be one of the first states in the country to really take down at-will employment and make a dignified job and a dignified workplace more of a guarantee for every LGBTQ person living in our great state.
Yeah, that's, I looked in that issue years ago, and I think maybe Montana is like the only state in the country that doesn't have at-will termination. It's a fascinating issue though, and one that we sort of take for granted, that you can just be fired because the boss wants to fire you. And maybe we should revisit that. Anyhow, great stuff, awesome. Mike, anything you want to add in this discussion on resources?
Yeah, two things we've been doing. One, we've developed a resource hub, an online resource hub that lists tons of resources. I know a link to Brave Space Alliance's COVID Trans Relief Fund page. We link to AFC's great work. But another thing we've done is this month and last month, we've given out nearly $100,000 in direct cash assistance to LGBTQ individuals impacted by COVID in downstate communities, including Springfield, Champaign, Bloomington Normal, Peoria, the Quad Cities, and Carbondale, which is really, really important and impactful. And I really want to just shout out and give thanks to the partner organizations who we've worked with on this, and that's Acorn Equality Fund in Peoria, Rainbow Cafe in Carbondale, the African American Lesbian Professionals Having a Say, Alphas in the Quad Cities, Prairie Pride Coalition in Bloomington, and the Phoenix Center in Springfield. Just, you know, the amazing partnership there in helping get this direct cash assistance to LGBTQ individuals in these downstate communities. And just the impact there. But I just wanted to highlight those two, but really, you know, just highlight again that resource hub that we have, and just the links to all the amazing resources, the great work that Brave Space Alliance is doing, the great work that AFC is providing the community and organizations across the state right now.
Yeah, I think it's worth giving you guys props for how intentional you've been in the last several years about doing that work outside of Chicago and Cook County. It's just been awesome to see the organizing that you've done in these communities across the state, and to hear that you're putting out this cash assistance in all these other communities. It's just, it's very heartening. Timothy, anything else you want to add to wrap us up?
Sure. I talked about earlier about the HIV Resource Hub. Thank you, Mike, for bringing that up. This is for not just people living in Chicago, but Cook County and the the collar counties as well, the entire Chicagoland metropolitan area. But if you're living with HIV, if you are HIV negative but are interested in prevention through PrEP or need HIV testing, this is perfect for you. It's a perfect resource to get assistance with the emergency financial assistance through rent, utility payments, case management, medications, medical care, food, mental health, substance use, really a kind of a one-stop shop in addition to helping those that are impacted by COVID-19. The HIV Resource Hub is really where you want to start. And you can contact them at 1-844-482-4040.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks everyone who tuned in. Thanks again to Emily and Josek from my office for putting this together. And thank you so much to our amazing panel, Tim Jackson, Mike Ziri, Stephanie Scora, Alderman Carlos Ramirez Rosa. You guys have just been phenomenal. If you didn't catch this live, we'll be circulating around on our social media. Thank you guys for the amazing work that you're doing out there in community. Get back to it, keep helping people, keep supporting our folks, and we'll be in touch. Thank you guys, take care.